Jasenovac, an infamous name that few know, but once you learn what happened there, you'll never forget. What if we told you there was a camp where the brutality surpassed even Auschwitz, where torture and murder were turned into art forms? Hidden in the shadows of history, Jasenovac stands as one of the most horrific chapters of the Holocaust. But why has the world ignored its existence? Let's uncover the shocking truths about a place where unimaginable horrors were born. The world knows the names of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Dachau. These are the infamous symbols of Nazi genocide, where the systematic horrors of the Holocaust unfolded. But there is one name that remains shrouded in near total obscurity: Jasenovac. Few have heard of it, and even fewer understand the unimaginable depths of horror that occurred within its gates. Located in the independent state of Croatia, a fascist puppet state under Nazi control, Jasenovac was unlike any other concentration camp. While camps like Auschwitz relied on industrial methods like gas chambers, Jasenovac's brutality was born from medieval cruelty. Its very design was an experiment in human suffering. Torture was not just a means of extermination, but an art form. The tools used for murder were improvised, the guards themselves actively involved in inventing new ways to inflict agony. What makes Jasenovac even more disturbing is the lack of attention it received after the war. As the Allies liberated camps across Europe, the horrors of Jasenovac were mostly ignored. While the world focused on the scale of the Nazi genocide, the atrocities in Croatia remained buried under layers of political silence and historical denial. But the victims of Jasenovac were not forgotten. The survivors, those who managed to escape the nightmarish death camp, carried with them the chilling stories of what happened behind its walls. Stories of sadistic guards who reveled in their role as executioners. Stories of whole families wiped out in a single night, their lives extinguished with methods so cruel they still defy explanation. Jasenovac may have been forgotten by much of the world, but its legacy of horror lingers. It was a camp that even the Nazis found difficult to stomach, and the lessons it teaches us about the darkest corners of human cruelty are not just important, they're essential. What really happened inside Jasenovac, and why did the world let its brutality slip into history's cracks? Join us as we uncover the chilling details of a camp so horrific it redefined the meaning of genocide. In 1941, the world was already reeling from the horrors of World War II. But what happened next in the Balkans would take cruelty to an unimaginable level. The Ustaša, a Croatian fascist movement, came to power with the help of Nazi Germany, establishing the independent state of Croatia, NDH. This new regime, built on a foundation of extreme nationalism and racial hatred, quickly turned its sights on anyone they deemed an enemy of the Croatian state: Serbs, Jews, Roma, and political dissidents. Unlike Nazi Germany, where the initial solution was mass deportation and forced labor, the Ustaša regime embraced a far more brutal solution: direct extermination. The Ustaša believed in a pure Croatia, free from the influence of what they viewed as undesirable groups, particularly Serbs, whom they considered historical enemies. This genocidal ideology led to the systematic targeting of entire populations for murder, forced conversion, and destruction. But they didn't just want to kill, they wanted to torture, humiliate, and terrorize their victims into submission, leaving lasting psychological scars on entire communities. Jasenovac became the epicenter of this genocidal vision. Established in August 1941, the camp was created not just as a place of imprisonment, but as a symbol of terror. Its primary function was to exterminate the Serbs, Jews, Roma, and anyone else deemed a threat to the regime's racial purity. But Jasenovac's purpose went beyond mere extermination. It was designed to break the spirit of those who survived, to instill fear in the broader population, and to send a message: resistance would not be tolerated. The Ustaša regime didn't just build a camp, they built a machine of cruelty. The first commandant of Jasenovac, Ljubo Miloš, was a key figure in shaping its brutal character. Unlike the mechanized killing methods used in Nazi camps, Jasenovac's methods were intimately personal, made even more disturbing by the involvement of the guards in the act of killing. The guards weren't just carrying out orders, they were actively competing to see who could devise the most horrific methods of torture and execution. From the start, Jasenovac was not a camp where the prisoners simply awaited death. It was a place of experimentation where the boundaries of human brutality were pushed to the limit. Unlike the efficiency of the gas chambers at places like Auschwitz, the violence at Jasenovac was hands-on, the guards personally involved in killing, torturing, and terrorizing the prisoners. This created an atmosphere of extreme sadism that would define Jasenovac's legacy. But Jasenovac didn't just represent the cruelty of its commanders, it was also a reflection of the cultural and ideological depravity that had taken root in Croatia under the Ustaša regime. It was a laboratory of cruelty where the limits of human suffering were tested and the power of fear was weaponized. This was a place where innocent people were turned into objects of torture and where guards competed to outdo each other in inflicting suffering. As the Ustaša regime ramped up its policies of ethnic cleansing, Jasenovac became the central instrument of their genocidal project. And as the bodies piled up, the legacy of Jasenovac would grow, becoming a dark chapter in the history of World War II that few would fully comprehend until decades later. What began as a place of execution would soon become something far worse, a symbol of human depravity that would never be forgotten by those who survived it. Jasenovac was not simply a death camp, it was a place where the very nature of torture and murder was redefined. The horrors that took place within its fences went beyond the scope of what most would imagine when thinking of a concentration camp. Here, death wasn't just a release from suffering, it was an art, personalized and deliberate in ways that would shock even the most hardened of war criminals.
Unlike other concentration camps that relied on gas chambers or industrial efficiency, Jasenovac used improvised weapons and tools of extreme cruelty. The camp was a chaotic machine of death, where the guards were actively involved in every step of the killing process. No victim was a nameless statistic. Each prisoner was subjected to an individual, terrifying execution, often involving innovative and sadistic methods of torture. At the heart of Jasenovac's brutality was the Serbosk, a curved knife originally designed for agricultural use. Modified for maximum bloodshed, the Serbosk became the preferred tool for executions. Guards used it to cut the throats of prisoners, often doing so in full view of other captives to instill psychological terror. These killings were not quick, they were drawn out, brutal, and painful. Mass murder was no longer a sterile act performed in silence, but a gruesome spectacle where the torturer and the victim faced each other directly, eye to eye. But the methods at Jasenovac weren't confined to just knives. Guards invented new tools of torture, and some of the most horrific ones were designed specifically to maximize human suffering. For example, killing hammers were fashioned to crush skulls, while hanging victims by their limbs became a common method to prolong agony. The most disturbing feature of this violence wasn't the tools themselves, but the sickening enthusiasm of the guards. They weren't simply following orders, they were competing to come up with the most creative ways to cause pain. The atmosphere inside Jasenovac was one of constant horror, with torture becoming a daily routine. The guards weren't just executing people, they were turning violence into a twisted form of entertainment. As a result, the prisoners often faced an agonizing process of prolonged suffering, where death would come not as a relief, but as a terrifying final escape from the cruelty they faced. In the early days of the camp, prisoners were often kept alive for weeks or even months, subjected to psychological torment and physical abuse. The guards would experiment with various methods of infliction, testing how much a person could endure before death. Medical knowledge was used for sinister purposes, as experiments on human suffering became a grotesque way for the guards to push the limits of pain. Children, women, and the elderly were not spared from these grotesque rituals. In fact, the violence against them was especially horrific, as guards developed methods tailored to their smaller bodies. Infants were often thrown into fires or beaten against walls until death. Women were kept alive longer for sexual violence and humiliation, and pregnant women were tortured in ways that ensured both the mother and child would meet a horrific end. The brutality at Jasenovac wasn't just about killing. It was about prolonged suffering and dehumanization. The guards at Jasenovac had turned murder into an art, and each death was a deliberate choice to make the victim suffer as much as possible before the final blow. This was a camp where the art of killing was perfected, and where the very humanity of both the guards and the prisoners was torn apart by the brutality that took place within its walls. As the camp continued its operations, the methods of torture and execution only grew more sophisticated, reflecting the sadistic creativity of the men running it. But the true scale of the horror wouldn't be understood until years later, when survivors began to share their stories of what had truly happened at Jasenovac. And the most chilling part? This was just the beginning. In 1942, Władysław Max Luburić took control of Jasenovac, and with him, the camp entered a new, even more sinister phase. Luburić wasn't just a commander. He was a mastermind of cruelty, a man whose obsession with sadistic violence turned Jasenovac into a place where torture became competitive, and human suffering was treated like a twisted sport. Luburić's arrival marked a dramatic shift in the culture of violence that permeated Jasenovac. Where area guards had been encouraged to be brutal, Luburić turned brutality into an art form. He actively promoted sadism, creating an environment where guards competed with each other to outdo each other in inventing new methods of pain. This wasn't just about executing prisoners. It was about taking pleasure in the agony of others and rewarding the most inventive torturers. Luburić's sadistic vision was clear. Murder wasn't enough. The victims needed to suffer first, and the more prolonged the pain, the better. He introduced killing contests, where guards competed to see who could kill the most prisoners in a single night, with the winner receiving promotions, better rations, and public praise. This perverse competition was institutionalized as part of the camp's culture, and it turned mass murder into a spectacle where guards didn't just follow orders, they relished their roles as executioners. One of the most infamous incidents occurred on the night of August 29, 1942, when Petar Bazika, a Franciscan friar and camp guard, set a grim record by killing 1,360 prisoners in a single night, using only a modified blade known as the Serbosk, a curved knife designed for slashing throats. This record, never broken, epitomized the depravity that had taken hold at Jasenovac under Luburić's leadership. Bazika's feat wasn't seen as an atrocity, but as an accomplishment that earned him praise from his superiors. What made Luburić's reign even more terrifying was his personal involvement in the violence. He didn't just direct the carnage from behind a desk, he was hands-on. Luburić would spend entire nights with the guards, observing and often participating in the killings. His direct engagement wasn't just about overseeing operations, it was about drawing satisfaction from the suffering he orchestrated. He was more than a commander. He was a perpetrator, an individual who seemed to derive a sense of pleasure from the pain he orchestrated. In fact, some accounts describe him as addicted to violence. Luburić didn't just order executions. He created elaborate tortures that lasted for days. Witnesses reported that he often took particular pleasure in making the deaths of certain victims especially slow and agonizing, choosing specific individuals for what can only be described as personal experimentation. His participation in these acts blurred the line between the camp's leadership and the perpetrators, making him not just an administrator of violence, but a true sadistic architect of suffering. One of the most horrifying elements of Luberich's leadership was his transformation of torture into a social event. He would invite other guards to watch as prisoners were tortured and executed. Death was not a private act at Jasenovac. It was a public performance. Guards gathered together, cheering as their colleagues outdid each other in their quest to inflict the most pain. The groans, screams, and death rattles became a twisted form of entertainment, echoing through the camp in a sickening symphony of horror. Luberich's influence also extended into the very culture of Jasenovac. He encouraged guards to document their exploits, keeping detailed records of how many prisoners they had killed and what methods they had used. These records weren't created for any bureaucratic reason. They were a badge of honor among the guards, a way to show off their sadistic achievements. To be recognized for creative cruelty was the ultimate reward. The camp's brutality reached even more extremes under Luberich's command. His reign saw the creation of specialized tools for killing and torturing. Shovels, hammers, and blades were designed and sharpened to be more effective at ending lives. Some tools were even crafted with the sole purpose of prolonging suffering, ensuring that victims would endure excruciating pain before their eventual death. Death was no longer quick. It was a prolonged, public ordeal meant to terrorize everyone within the camp and beyond its gates.
The sexual violence against women was also amplified under Luberich. He introduced torturous sexual abuse, where women were not simply executed, but subjected to humiliation and rape. These actions weren't isolated, they were systematic, designed to break the spirit of the survivors and degrade the victims before their eventual execution. Pregnant women were not spared. The camp guards went as far as killing unborn children in the most brutal ways imaginable, ensuring that no one was left untouched by the horrors of Jasenovac. Luberich's leadership at Jasenovac didn't just result in the deaths of tens of thousands. It turned the camp into an institution of terror, where creativity in violence was not just rewarded, but celebrated. His leadership brought the camp to a level of sadism and barbarity that shocked even the Nazi officials who, despite their own involvement in genocide, were taken aback by the sheer personal involvement and enthusiasm of the Jasenovac guards. Under Luberich, Jasenovac became something beyond a death camp. It became a shrine to cruelty, where murder was an act of personal expression, where torture and execution were refined to a grotesque form of art. What had begun as a place of mass murder evolved into a place where violence was a means of social status, and where the horrors inflicted on the victims were not just acts of hatred, but were celebrated by those who inflicted them. And the worst part? This was only the beginning of a horrifying new chapter in Jasenovac's existence, one that would redefine cruelty in ways that no one could have ever imagined. In the darkness of Jasenovac, there was an element that made the brutality even chilling: the involvement of religious figures in the atrocities. What should have been a refuge of moral and spiritual guidance instead became a grotesque distortion of faith. Catholic priests and Franciscan friars, men who were supposed to be protectors of life, became willing participants in the genocidal violence that defined the camp. Jasenovac wasn't just a place where death reigned. It was a place where religion was weaponized to justify the unimaginable. Many of the camp's guards and administrators were Ustaša sympathizers who saw their actions as part of a sacred mission. The twisted ideologies that fueled the violence found a grotesque ally in religion, as some clergy members actively supported the actions of the Ustaša regime. Their role in these atrocities wasn't limited to providing moral cover. They were directly involved in the violence, helping to administer and even participate in the torture and executions. One of the most notorious religious figures to be involved in the horrors of Jasenovac was Brother Miroslav Filipović, a Franciscan friar who became infamous for his active role in the camp. Known by prisoners as Brother Satan, Filipović was not just a bystander, he was deeply involved in the execution of prisoners.
His religious status allowed him to move freely within the camp, where he performed brutal executions and tortures, often using his position to gain access to vulnerable prisoners. Filipovich was not alone in his actions. Other clergy members, including many priests, used their positions to legitimize the murder of innocent people. They provided religious justification for the actions of the Ustaša regime, preaching that the mass killings were divinely sanctioned. This perversion of faith helped fuel the sadistic behavior of the guards, many of whom were indoctrinated to believe that their actions were not only acceptable, but necessary for the moral purification of Croatia. These religious figures didn't just sit idly by, they actively participated in the torture and murder of prisoners. In some cases, they even held mock religious ceremonies to humiliate and dehumanize their victims. The desecration of religious symbols was a common tactic in the camp. Orthodox Christian crosses, which represented the Serbian identity, were burned or destroyed in front of prisoners, further stripping away their sense of self. In some instances, priests would force Orthodox Christian prisoners to convert to Catholicism before executing them, often subjecting them to physical abuse as part of the process. What's even more terrifying is the way these actions were framed by the Ustaša regime as part of a holy war. Religious leaders, such as Bishop Aloysius Stepinac, who was later beatified by the Catholic Church, were sympathetic to the cause, with many failing to speak out against the atrocities. This created a chilling environment where violence was normalized and the sacred was used as a tool of destruction. For the victims, the involvement of religious figures added an additional layer of betrayal. Those who had once found solace in faith were forced to face violence from the very people who were meant to provide comfort. Instead of offering prayers, these religious figures delivered torture, forcing the prisoners into a nightmarish experience where their torment was spiritualized by the very men they had trusted to protect them. It is almost incomprehensible that such sacred figures could become agents of terror, but it happened at Jasenovac. And it wasn't just a few rogue individuals, it was a widespread phenomenon. Religious figures became integrated into the system of murder, adding a layer of ideological and spiritual legitimacy to the horrors that were taking place. In this way, Jasenovac wasn't just a physical site of brutality. It became a spiritual battlefield where the darkest impulses of humanity were sanctioned by the very institutions that were supposed to protect life. And this makes the crimes at Jasenovac all the more disturbing. The human capacity for evil was not only unleashed by political and military leaders, it was endorsed and enabled by those in positions of moral authority. The religious figures who were supposed to offer salvation instead helped enslave the soul of the camp's victims, turning faith into a weapon of torture. And perhaps the most haunting aspect of this is the silence that followed the war. The involvement of religious figures in the violence at Jasenovac wasn't just ignored by the perpetrators, it was covered up by the Church. Post-war, the Catholic Church and other religious institutions largely downplayed their complicity, allowing the true extent of this perversion of faith to remain hidden for decades. Historical revisionism ensured that the atrocities were swept under the rug, and the role of clergy in the genocide was minimized. The victims of Jasenovac, especially those who were targeted for their religious beliefs, faced the ultimate betrayal: murder at the hands of those who should have been their protectors. And while the Church may not have openly condoned the violence, its silence in the face of such extreme cruelty helped to ensure that the suffering at Jasenovac would largely be forgotten by history. But this silence would not last forever. The stories of the survivors, the voices of the victims who died at the hands of the Church's perversion of faith, still call out for recognition and justice. And perhaps one of the greatest questions we must confront is, how can we ever reconcile faith with the evil done in its name? The horrors of Jasenovac didn't just tear at the physical, they tore at the very soul of its victims. For those who survived, the psychological scars of the camp are wounds that can never truly heal. The violence was not only brutal and savage, but it was also systematic, designed to break the spirit, crush the will to live, and render the prisoners not just dead, but utterly dehumanized. What made Jasenovac stand apart from other camps wasn't just the scale of the violence, but the methods of psychological torment employed by the guards. This was not a place where victims were merely killed. They were broken mentally, emotionally, and spiritually before they were executed. For the survivors, the experience was not just a physical injury, it was one of relentless psychological assault. One of the most disturbing aspects of Jasenovac's brutality was how it weaponized relationships. Families were torn apart, often forced to watch each other's deaths. Mothers were forced to see their children executed. Fathers had to witness their wives being tortured, and siblings were made to witness the execution of one another. This psychological cruelty wasn't accidental, it was calculated to instill a profound sense of helplessness and despair. The emotional toll on these victims was imaginable. Prisoners were forced to confront the death of their loved ones in ways that were designed to make them question everything they held dear. Entire communities were irradiated in the span of a few weeks or months, leaving survivors with no sense of identity. When your family is murdered in front of you, your home and belongings stripped away, and your very sense of self is erased, what is left? What can possibly remain when hope is torn from you and the human soul is pushed to the brink? And even when you do survive, if you manage to escape, your life is never the same. The survivors of Jasenovac often didn't have anywhere to return to. Their homes were all gone. Their relatives were dead. Their minds were shattered. They lived in the nightmare of what they had seen. The horrors of this camp lived on in the minds of the survivors, and they're still living in some of them today.
And it wasn't just the immediate violence that devastated the victims. It was the prolonged suffering. At Jasenovac, torture wasn't reserved for the moments before death. Prisoners were often held alive for weeks, sometimes even months, while the guards experimented with new forms of violence. Each day in the camp was a new form of psychological and physical torture. Victims were stripped of their dignity and forced to endure the humiliation of knowing that death was inevitable, but still having to live through the torment. The psychological abuse didn't stop at death, it extended beyond the grave. The methods of killing were meant to leave survivors with no closure, no peace. The practice of dismembering bodies, displaying severed heads on stakes, and hanging organs in view of other prisoners was designed to ensure that those who lived would never be free from the sight of suffering. It created an atmosphere where death was a spectacle, not a quiet end. The screams of the dying echoed through the camp, a constant reminder that in Jasenovac there was no refuge from fear. Survivors were left with more than just the memory of their own suffering. They carried the memories of those they watched die. Children, parents, and friends were all witnesses to trauma, and they carried that trauma for the rest of their lives. The haunting images of brutal executions, the sounds of death, and the faces of the murdered would stay with them long after the camp was liberated. Even years after the war, the scars of Jasenovac remained, and the survivors lived with the mental and emotional toll of having seen the very worst that humanity could inflict. Many survivors never spoke of what they had endured, unable to find words for the unspeakable horrors they had witnessed. Silence became their coping mechanism, and for those who did speak, their testimonies were often dismissed or ignored. The sheer weight of the trauma was simply too much to bear for many, and for years the world refused to acknowledge their suffering. Even the memory of Jasenovac itself was obscured by the broader narrative of World War II atrocities. Its horrors were swept aside in favor of focusing on the better-known horrors of other camps, like Auschwitz, leaving Jasenovac's survivors to suffer in the shadows of history. This psychological erosion was not just a consequence of physical torture. It was a calculated part of the Ustaša's goal to destroy not just bodies, but minds. By instilling a sense of helplessness and hopelessness, the guards turned Jasenovac into a place where the human spirit itself was under attack. They knew that by stripping victims of their loved ones, their dignity, and their hope, they could break their will to survive. The effect of such psychological trauma is still felt today. For survivors, the haunting memories of Jasenovac never truly fade. The mental and emotional scars remain even decades after the liberation. The trauma wasn't just about surviving the camp. It was about living with the knowledge that human beings could be reduced to nothing more than objects of torture and death. This trauma shaped the lives of entire generations, and its impact continues to ripple through the lives of the survivors' families. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Jasenovac's legacy is that it was a camp built not only to kill, but to destroy the human soul, and in many ways it succeeded. Survivors were left with no closure, no justice, and often no support as they tried to rebuild their lives. The world had moved on, but for them, the scars of Jasenovac remained, always lurking beneath the surface of their daily lives, a constant reminder that they had lived through something that should never have happened. And the most chilling part of this is that for the perpetrators of Jasenovac, the psychological trauma they caused was nothing more than collateral damage in their pursuit of an ethnically pure Croatia. The guards, who enjoyed their role as torturers, and the leaders who ran the camp, saw their actions as justified by their ideology. The survivors, however, were left with a legacy of suffering that no one would understand for decades to come. The psychological toll of Jasenovac wasn't just about the immediate suffering. It was about the long-term damage done to the survivors, to their families, and to the communities they came from. And as we continue to reflect on the horrors of Jasenovac, one thing becomes clear. The true cost of these atrocities isn't just measured in the number of bodies, but in the broken lives and endless trauma that lingered long after the last shot was fired. While Jasenovac is most often remembered for its extreme cruelty and horrific methods of execution, there was another, deeply unsettling aspect of the camp that set it apart from other concentration camps: its economic exploitation of human beings. Jasenovac was not just a death camp, it was a machine of profit, where the suffering of the victims was turned into financial gain for the perpetrators. This commodification of human life in the most grotesque ways added yet another layer to the atrocities committed at the camp. The Ustaša regime running Jasenovac was not content just to kill its prisoners. It sought to extract value from the very remains of those it slaughtered. As much as it was a place of murder, it was also a place of plunder, a place where human bodies became commodities and death itself became a business. One of the most horrifying aspects of this economy of death was the systematic extraction of valuable body parts from the victims. Gold teeth were pried from the mouths of the dead, and human hair was shaved off for use in textiles. Even more disturbingly, human fat was rendered into soap, a practice so repugnant that it defies the imagination. These practices weren't isolated incidents, but part of an institutionalized system of exploitation that permeated the entire camp. The most grotesque of these operations was the production of soap and other products made from human remains. After the bodies were killed and disposed of, the fat was collected, melted down, and processed into soap, which was then sold or used for the benefit of the camp's administrators and guards. This sickening practice of turning human flesh into consumer goods represented the ultimate degradation, not just the physical death of the victims, but their transformation into raw materials for profit.
Alongside this, human hair, stripped from the heads of the murdered, was used to produce textiles. Garments and fabrics were made from this hair, and some accounts suggest that hair was woven into items that were sent back to Nazi Germany for use in the Reich's war effort. The fact that prisoners' hair was treated as a commodity for manufacturing while they were still alive, or immediately after their deaths, adds another level of dehumanization. The very identity of the prisoners was ripped from them, turning their most basic traits into products for sale.
The guards and administrators of Jasenovac weren't just concerned with eliminating undesirables, they were turning their bodies into a source of income. The idea that human suffering could be monetized was a concept so disturbing that it would make even the most cynical observer recoil. This wasn't simply about using the labor of the prisoners, as in other camps. It was about turning the bodies of the murdered into raw materials for the economy of the camp. At Jasenovac, this process was carried out with chilling efficiency. Guards, who had already grown desensitized to the violence they inflicted, were able to turn death into a business transaction, treating each victim not as a person, but as an object to be harvested. Prisoners who were murdered were often stripped of their belongings before they were executed, and these items were either stolen or sold by the guards. Clothes, jewelry, money, anything of value was taken from the victims and redistributed, further enriching the brutal administrators running the camp. The economic exploitation of the victims didn't just occur after their deaths. Prisoners who were forced to survive in the camp's labor sections, where they were subjected to extreme physical toil, often working until they died, were used as human capital for the regime. The work assignments given to these prisoners were meant not for any productive end, but simply as a form of slow execution. The forced labor was grueling and dangerous, and those who failed to meet the impossible quotas were punished or executed. What makes this exploitation particularly sinister is that it wasn't just about practicality, it was part of the regime's ideology of dehumanization. Prisoners were treated as disposable resources, not individuals with lives, histories, or families. The Ustaša's method of control was based on reducing human beings to mere objects that could be used and discarded for personal gain. The most disturbing part of this system was the personal involvement of the guards. They didn't just follow orders from above, they participated in the plunder themselves. Guards would rummage through prisoners' belongings, taking whatever they could find of value. Some were even known to sell these items on the black market, adding a further layer of exploitation to the already horrific crimes. This economic exploitation continued long after the camp was closed. Many of the items taken from Jasenovac found their way into the hands of Nazi officials and others who profited from the brutality of the camp. The international trade in these stolen goods further perpetuated the cycle of suffering and loss. Even in death, the victims of Jasenovac were denied any semblance of dignity, reduced to mere assets to be exploited. The sadistic creativity of Jasenovac's camp commanders wasn't limited to physical torture, it extended to the very system of death. By turning murder into a business operation, the perpetrators removed any trace of humanity from the victims and treated them solely as commodities. This was a calculated act of cruelty where the guards profited off the misery they inflicted. The plundered goods, from human remains to personal belongings, weren't just symbolic of the financial rewards of death. They were a powerful reminder that the guards weren't just performing their duties as soldiers, they were participants in a system of corruption that treated human lives as property. The exploitation of these victims' bodies, their belongings, and their very existence is one of the chilling aspects of the camp's economy. Jasenovac was a place where death became profitable, and that twisted reality only deepened the horror of the atrocities committed there. It wasn't just that the victims were murdered, it was that their very existence was turned into something to be exploited, traded, and sold, ensuring that the legacy of their suffering continued long after their deaths. And the most harrowing question remains: how much longer would this cycle of death and profit have continued if the camp had not been liberated? As the war drew to a close in 1945 and the Axis powers began to crumble under the weight of the advancing Allied forces, the Ustaša regime knew their time was running out. The Yugoslav partisans, a communist-led resistance group, were steadily pushing through the Balkans and approaching Jasenovac, determined to put an end to the atrocities.
But instead of surrendering or attempting to save their lives, the guards at Jasenovac did something even more disturbing. They carried out a final spree of killings, aiming to eliminate as many witnesses as possible before fleeing the camp. When the partisans arrived, Jasenovac had already been abandoned by the majority of its guards, who had taken steps to ensure their crimes would be covered up. The final days of the camp were marked by an intensified effort to destroy evidence, erasing any trace of the systematic murder and torture that had been carried out for almost 4 years. But no amount of destruction could entirely erase the scale of the atrocities that had occurred. The guards at Jasenovac were not content with simply evacuating and leaving behind a pile of dead bodies. They wanted to eradicate every trace of the camp's operation. They began by murdering the remaining prisoners who were too weak to walk, those who had been left behind as disposable. These individuals had no way of escaping or fleeing. They were simply executed in their final moments. The next phase of destruction was the forced death marches. The remaining prisoners were marched toward the Austrian border, a journey designed not only to kill those too weak to survive the journey, but to humiliate and terrorize them one last time. Those who couldn't keep up with the pace of the march were left behind and shot, while the others were subjected to exhaustion, malnutrition, and beatings as they made their way toward their final destination. The death march became yet another act of horror, a final reminder of the absolute cruelty that defined Jasenovac's existence. As these final days unfolded, the sense of urgency among the guards was palpable. Their sole concern was ensuring the elimination of every potential witness. This included not only prisoners, but also anyone who had been a part of the camp's infrastructure, like workers, collaborators, and some of the local civilians who had been involved in the operations. In their eyes, everyone connected to the camp needed to be silenced before the partisans could arrive and expose the horrors of the camp to the world. On the night of April 22, 1945, the last remaining prisoners in Jasenovac were murdered in cold blood. The camp's final killing spree saw prisoners rounded up and executed in mass with severe brutality. In one last act of cruelty, the guards dispersed the bodies throughout the camp, burned the remains, and destroyed the structures that had housed the instruments of murder. Meanwhile, as the Yugoslav partisans closed in on the camp, there was a last-ditch effort to erase the evidence. Documents were destroyed, photographs burned, and the camp's administrative records were deliberately obliterated. What remained was a ghost camp, its buildings partially demolished, its grounds stained with blood, and its walls echoing with the final screams of its victims. But even in the midst of this desperate destruction, the remaining survivors were able to bear witness to the horrors. When the partisans finally liberated Jasenovac on May 2, 1945, they found a scene beyond comprehension. The site was in ruins, yet the evidence of mass murder was undeniable. Mass graves filled with bodies, rooms filled with human remains, clothing, shoes, and personal belongings scattered everywhere. The remains of victims were still present, and the stench of death hung heavy in the air, a grim testament to the atrocities that had taken place. Yet, in the aftermath of the war, the true extent of the atrocities at Jasenovac remained largely concealed. Most of the camp's perpetrators had fled before the partisans arrived, escaping to parts of Western Europe and South America, where they were protected by sympathetic governments or intelligence agencies. As a result, few perpetrators were ever held accountable for the horrors of Jasenovac. In the years following the camp's liberation, the Yugoslav government attempted to conceal the scale of the atrocities, instead focusing on the anti-fascist struggle and national unity. The survivors, many of whom had lost their families, their homes, and their entire communities, were left with little support or recognition. The emotional and psychological toll of their experiences was compounded by the silence that surrounded their suffering. Jasenovac's role in the broader narrative of the Holocaust and World War II was largely overshadowed by the atrocities in Germany and Poland. As time went on, the camp's significance was buried under the weight of political and ideological struggles that dominated the post-war years. But as more survivors spoke out, and as historians began to piece together the evidence, the legacy of Jasenovac's brutality slowly began to surface. The final days of
Jasenovac, like the camp's entire existence, serve as a chilling reminder of the depths of human cruelty. The destruction of evidence, the silencing of witnesses, and the deliberate erasure of history only further prove that the Ustaša regime was willing to go to any lengths to cover up their crimes. And in their wake, they left behind a scar on the land, a scar that would not heal for generations. As we reflect on the end of Jasenovac, we must ask, what can we learn from the attempt to erase such a brutal chapter from history? How can we ensure that the victims of Jasenovac and other atrocities are never forgotten, and that the lessons of such horrors are passed down to future generations? The answers to these questions are more urgent now than ever. When the Yugoslav partisans finally liberated Jasenovac on May 2, 1945, they entered a scene of unimaginable horror. What they found was more than just the remnants of a concentration camp. It was a graveyard of human cruelty, where the echoes of suffering still lingered in the air. The camp was mostly abandoned by then, the majority of the guards having fled before the partisans arrived. But the destruction they left behind was so thorough, it seemed as if the camp had been abandoned in haste, with little regard for the lives it had destroyed. The first thing the liberators encountered was the horrific evidence of the camp's operations. Mass graves filled with thousands of bodies, some barely covered with dirt, others left exposed to the elements, were scattered throughout the area. The smell of decay was overpowering, as the bodies of the victims, many of whom had been executed just days before, lay in heaps, untouched and forgotten by their killers. As the partisans began to examine the camp more closely, they discovered rooms filled with human hair, cut from the victims before they were murdered. This was hair that had been shaved off and collected as part of the regime's macabre economy of death. Clothing, shoes, and personal belongings were scattered throughout the camp as if the victims had simply vanished, leaving behind only the traces of their lives. In addition to the bodies and personal items, the partisans uncovered tools of torture, including sharpened knives, hammers, and other makeshift instruments that had been used to inflict unspeakable pain on the prisoners. The workshops where these tools were made stood as grim reminders of the industry of cruelty that had thrived at Jasenovac. But it wasn't just the physical evidence of the violence that shocked the partisans. It was the scope of the crimes. The survivors who were found in the camp, many of whom had been living in the most brutal conditions imaginable, recounted their experiences in harrowing detail. Their stories told of the psychological and emotional torment they had endured, of being forced to watch their families and friends tortured and killed, and of the constant fear of being next. The full extent of the atrocities at Jasenovac began to emerge as survivors, some of the only witnesses left, told their stories. The scale of the genocide that had occurred in the camp was staggering, and it became clear that Jasenovac was not just another death camp. It was a lab of human suffering, a place where the very limits of brutality were pushed beyond what anyone could have imagined. However, the liberation of Jasenovac did not immediately lead to justice for the victims. The majority of the perpetrators, including key figures like Vacislav Max Luberic, had fled long before the partisans arrived. Luberic, who had been the mastermind behind much of the cruelty at Jasenovac, managed to escape to Spain, where he lived under the protection of Francisco Franco's fascist regime until his death in 1969. He was never held accountable for his actions, and the other guards and administrators who had participated in the atrocities also managed to evade justice.
In the years following the liberation of Jasenovac, the Yugoslav government, which had been deeply involved in its own political struggles, was hesitant to fully confront the scale of the atrocities at Jasenovac. Political considerations often overshadowed the need for justice, and the survivors found little support in the new regime. Instead of receiving recognition for their suffering, many were left to deal with the psychological trauma of their experiences on their own, with little acknowledgement from the state. Meanwhile, the broader world had already moved on to focus on other aspects of the war and the Holocaust. Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Dachau became the iconic names of Nazi atrocities, while Jasenovac remained on the fringes of historical memory. The international community largely overlooked Jasenovac, and the Ustaša crimes, while acknowledged by some, remained underreported and overshadowed by the more well-known atrocities in other camps. As the Cold War deepened, Yugoslavia's political stance further delayed proper recognition of Jasenovac's place in history. The communist government, focused on unifying different ethnic groups and stabilizing the region, was hesitant to open old wounds. As a result, the story of Jasenovac remained buried, and many of its victims' voices were silenced for decades. But despite the political silencing and historical oversight, the survivors never forgot. Over time, some of the few remaining witnesses began to speak out, recounting their traumatic experiences, and historians began to dig deeper into the archive of evidence that had been left behind. The revelations about Jasenovac's brutality began to gain wider recognition in the latter half of the 20th century. Today, Jasenovac is recognized as one of the most horrific concentration camps of World War II, but its path to acknowledgement has been long and fraught with political and historical battles. The survivors, who lived through the horrors of Jasenovac, now stand as the last witnesses to its atrocities, and it is their testimony, along with the physical evidence discovered after the camp's liberation, that will ensure the story of Jasenovac is never forgotten. But one question still lingers. Why was Jasenovac allowed to remain in the shadows for so long? The full truth of its horrors may never be fully realized, but the world can no longer ignore its dark legacy. The legacy of Jasenovac is one of silence, denial, and forgotten suffering. For decades, this horrific chapter in World War II history remained in the shadows, overshadowed by the more widely recognized atrocities in Nazi concentration camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka. The scale of cruelty at Jasenovac, where not just mass murder but sadistic torture and dehumanization were commonplace, left a lasting scar, yet the camp's name was largely absent from global discussions about the Holocaust and genocide. Why has Jasenovac remained so largely forgotten? The question remains complex, tied to political interests, historical revisionism, and a lack of accountability for the perpetrators. Yugoslav authorities downplayed the significance of Jasenovac in the immediate aftermath of the war, instead focusing on the anti-fascist narrative that served to unify the country. This political maneuvering meant that survivors were often denied the recognition they so desperately needed, and the full extent of the camp's horrors was not addressed for many years. In the early years after the war, the Yugoslav government was focused on rebuilding the country and creating a unified socialist state. The role of ethnic tensions and nationalism in the formation of the independent state of Croatia was minimized, and the Ustaša's actions were largely glossed over in favor of a broader anti-fascist resistance narrative. Even as survivors began to speak out, their testimonies, as painful as they were often met with skepticism, and the trauma they experienced was not given the weight it deserved. This historical silence was further compounded by the Cold War, during which discussions about the atrocities in Croatia were overshadowed by the global geopolitical struggle. For many years, Jasenovac remained an obscurity, relegated to the margins of Holocaust history. This was in part because it did not fit neatly into the established narratives of Nazi genocide. While Auschwitz and other camps became central to discussions about the Nazi regime's systematic genocide, Jasenovac stood as a reminder of the horrors wrought by local fascist ideologies. The Ustaša's crimes were seen as a separate issue, and thus not given the same historical prominence. Even as survivor testimony began to surface, the horrific personal involvement of guards and the institutionalized cruelty remained largely unexplored in broader international discourse. The political climate of post-war Yugoslavia and the subsequent silence surrounding Jasenovac allowed for revisionism to take hold in certain circles. Some exiled Croatian communities, especially those with ties to the Ustaša regime, sought to downplay the extent of Jasenovac's atrocities. This revisionism continued through the decades, contributing to a lack of international recognition for the scale of the crimes committed at the camp. Even today, the number of victims at Jasenovac remains a contentious issue. Initial estimates place the death toll at anywhere from 500,000 to 700,000, but modern scholarship has revised these numbers downward to somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000. Yet still, this represents one of the largest civilian massacres in Europe during World War II. Despite these estimates, the true scale of Jasenovac's horrors will likely never be fully understood. The deliberate destruction of evidence by the Ustaša regime, the lack of systematic record-keeping, and the abandonment of the camp by the perpetrators made it incredibly difficult to piece together a comprehensive record of the atrocities. The destruction of records in the final days of the camp's operation only deepened the mystery surrounding the precise number of victims. Jasenovac's forgotten status also meant that few perpetrators were ever held accountable for their crimes. Many of the camp's administrators and guards escaped in the chaos that followed the war, with some finding refuge in Western Europe and South America, protected by sympathetic regimes or intelligence agencies. Vacislav Max Luburic, the camp's most notorious commandant, lived the remainder of his life in Spain under the protection of Francisco Franco's fascist regime. He was never prosecuted, and his crimes went unpunished, leaving the survivors with little closure. Perhaps one of the most enduring consequences of Jasenovac's historical silence is the lack of proper commemoration for the victims. While other concentration camps, like Auschwitz, have become sites of remembrance and educational pilgrimage, Jasenovac's victims have had to fight for recognition. Memorials at the site, though established, have been tainted by political considerations. The Yugoslav government's initial reluctance to properly address the ethnic dimensions of the genocide led to competing narratives of suffering, which continue to affect how Jasenovac is remembered today. As the years have passed, the legacy of Jasenovac has begun to emerge from the shadows, but the struggle for recognition is far from over. Survivors continue to speak out, and their testimonies, painful as they are finally being acknowledged. But the question remains, how could such horrors be so easily forgotten? And what does this say about our ability to remember and learn from history? The survivors, who lived through the unimaginable in Jasenovac, now find themselves fighting against time to ensure that the truth about the camp's brutal legacy is not erased. As Jasenovac begins to claim its rightful place in Holocaust history, it serves as a stark reminder of the importance of bearing witness and honoring the victims, even when their stories have been buried by political silence and historical neglect. Today, as we look back at the atrocities committed at Jasenovac, we are faced with a chilling reality. The history of human cruelty is not as far behind us as we might like to believe. Jasenovac's legacy teaches us that we must confront the darkest parts of our past, because failing to do so allows the forces of hate and violence to rise again. The lessons of Jasenovac must be remembered and passed on, not just to honor the victims, but to ensure that future generations never repeat the horrors that occurred there. As the world continues to face new challenges and rising tensions, we must ask ourselves, will we allow the lessons of Jasenovac to be forgotten once more?
the question remains, and with it, the urgency to remember.